Hey folks, it's Mira Dessy, the Ingredient Guru, and I am really excited. I am here today interviewing Lara Adler, and we are going to have a fabulous conversation. She is one of my favorite people to talk to because we just have these incredible conversations about all the stupid stuff they do to our food. And Lara really is the expert when it comes to environmental issues and how that impacts our health and wellness. I'd like to start by giving you a little bit more information about her, and then we are just going to dive in, have this great conversation. So Lara Adler is an environmental toxins expert and educator. She's also a certified holistic health coach who trains and educates practitioners within the health and wellness community to better understand the links between environmental chemicals and their impact on disease states. And we're talking everything from weight gain to diabetes, thyroid disease, infertility, all of that. So she does this so that these people can better support their clients. Her students also include direct sales consultants who want to become more articulate about the products they represent, and also health enthusiasts who are proactive about their health and their family's well-being. Lara, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. I think this conversation was long overdue because we are obviously on exactly the same wavelength in what we talk about, just focused on a slightly different area that's super complementary. So I'm just super happy to be able to have this conversation publicly instead of us spending hours on the phone privately together.
Yeah, no, this is great. I'm just so excited to share you and your information with everybody. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is some of the things that are being done to our food. And when we look at that, we also have to look at some of the contaminants that our food come into contact with.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that's not really on the label, so people have to be aware of it on their own, is the food contact things like BPA or other materials that come into contact with our food. Yeah. Can you kind of give us a little information about why this is so important, why we need to be aware of these contacts?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I get even into the BPA thing, I'll back up a little bit further and just kind of contextualize why this is important in general, like why it's important for us as consumers and people who are looking after our health and who are the people that read ingredients and just being human beings, why we have to be mindful of the chemicals that we are really being exposed to on a daily basis. And the reality is at least here in the United States, the numbers differ elsewhere. There's about 84,000 chemicals that are registered for use in the United States. And out of those 84,000, we would assume that somebody has been testing them for safety to make sure that they're not going to cause cancer or any other kind of health issues. But the reality is that that's not true. And of those 84,000, there's really only about 200 that have been adequately tested for safety, which leaves us in the dark about a lot of the other ones. And so there's that happening, right? We've got this landscape where there's chemicals being used in all of these consumer products, in the furniture that we buy, the personal care products that we use, the food that we buy, whether we know it or not. And the reality is that these chemicals are actually entering our bodies. So the CDC does biomonitoring studies where they're regularly looking to see what chemicals are ending up in people. And they're finding that we are loaded with hundreds and hundreds of chemicals that are neurotoxic, carcinogenic, they're hormone disruptors, they're reproductive toxins, and research has been digging in this really ugly pile of information for decades and finding that these exposures that we're getting every day in little tiny amounts are actually negatively impacting our health, and they're leading to things like diabetes and obesity and heart disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions, like all this awful stuff. And so it's super important for people to look beyond sort of nutrition and exercise and stress management and sleep when they're looking at just having a healthy lifestyle, because the chemical toxins that we're exposed to really are essential in that equation. to getting and staying healthy. So that's sort of like the bigger picture context stuff. The BPA piece is one of the ones that I love talking about the most because it has so much what I call street cred. Like,
Yeah.
everybody knows, they've even heard of BPA. They may not even know what it is, but there's an awareness about what it is. And most people sort of generally assume it falls into the it's bad for me category, but they don't really understand beyond that.
Yeah.
And I really think that it's important for people to understand why they're making any changes. Like, if they're at the grocery store and they're trying to buy this versus that, once they really understand why, it makes the decision-making process that much easier for them. And then they don't have to think about it anymore. So what is BPA? BPA is it's a chemical that's in the bisphenol family. It is a plasticizer. It's used to, it's found in other places beyond canned foods, which we can certainly talk about. But most commonly it's known for being found in polycarbonate plastics. So that's like your food processor bowl, your Nalgene water bottle, your baby bottles, the clear shatterproof plastic. And it's there to lend some rigidity so that it's shatterproof. The problem with BPA is that it readily leaches and migrates out of the materials that they're in into whatever it's coming into contact with. And that includes the food that we're eating and the waters that we're drinking and beverages that we're drinking. And one of the most common places where BPA is found is in the lining of canned foods. And this is an FDA requirement that cans have this lining to prevent the food from eating away at the can and causing opportunities for bacteria to grow because of oxygen entering the can, or to prevent the off flavoring. So if you've ever, I'm sure that at some point in our history, we've like tasted something and it just tastes like a tin can. And that's what those coatings are trying to avoid. And so there's a couple of things that can increase the rate at which the molecules of these chemicals, BPA, migrate into our food. And those things are heat, oil, acidity, and abrasion. And we're looking at canned foods. Most canned foods are what? How are they processed?
Yeah, heat and pressure.
Heat and pressure. So obviously this depends. So things like soda, for example, are not heat canned. They're cold packed, but there is pressure. And so, if we're looking at the spectrum of different types of canned items, whether it's beer, soup, soda, beans, tomatoes, there are different degrees to which that BPA will leach. And the reason why this is a problem is because BPA is a synthetic estrogen. It behaves like estrogen in our bodies. So I'm sure that in your work, you talk about phytoestrogens and soy and things like that. And, there's rampant issues with things like estrogen dominance, right? Which people are struggling with. Estrogen or any hormonal disruption, any disruption of the endocrine system can cause everything from weight gain and diabetes to predispose somebody to higher risks of cancer, to learning disabilities. Like, it really runs the gamut.
Well, and the other thing is, it actually starts much earlier than we anticipate, because studies have shown, they used to think the placental barrier was impervious.
Yeah.
And now we know that's absolutely not true.
Yes.
And when they look at cord blood of newborn babies, their
BPA is there.
Contaminated. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And not just BPA. A lot of
hundreds of chemicals. Yeah. And, CDC studies have found BPA in 98% of people that they've tested. So pretty much everyone. And, what's frustrating, and it's both frustrating and good news, is that our bodies are able to metabolize BPA pretty quickly, like within a couple of hours, meaning that we're able to excrete it out in urine for the most part. The problem is, because we're constantly being exposed to it, we're never able to actually clear the system of BPA, which is why it's showing up in 98% of people, despite the fact that it metabolizes quite easily. So when we're faced with that sort of dynamic, the only solution is to reduce the amount of BPA that's coming into the body so that it can do its job and clear it out quickly. And that really comes down to the consumer, unfortunately, because the government's not doing very much to regulate these chemicals. It's a huge industry. It really comes down to the consumer to become educated and empowered with real information as to what it is that they're looking for, so they can start avoiding exposure to these types of chemicals.
And it's not just, you mentioned that this is a bisphenol. So
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about all of those things that we're seeing all over the place now that say
BPA-free stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a bait and switch.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of BS. So what's happening? So bisphenol, just like you said, is it's a family of chemicals, and there's many chemicals in that family. And BPA, or bisphenol A, is just one of them. And so what manufacturers have started to do, whether it's in plastics or canned foods or anything else, or cash register receipts, which is also where BPA is found, what manufacturers have started to do, because there's been this consumer push to be like, wait, what? BPA is bad? I don't want BPA. But these are people that don't know anything about the chemistry or the science behind how these molecules are created. So manufacturers basically said, okay, like, no problem. We'll take out BPA. And what we're going to do is we're going to replace it with another chemical in the same family that has a different name, but is structurally nearly identical. So what a lot of manufacturers have done is swap BPA with BPS.
Mm-hmm.
And research is showing that BPS is just as bad, if not worse, in terms of the negative health effects than BPA. So this is really, like, all those BPA-free claims just really raise my hackles, because they're duping consumers. They're providing a false sense of security.
Well, and so talk to us a little bit about, if you're looking to switch away from that, how do you find containers that don't have that, and where do you make that shift?
Right.
Because, for example, there are some things where if it's a glass jar, but it has a sealed lid, you and I both know that lid is going to contain something. And so how much of that is getting in, especially if we're talking heat and pressure and contact. So what are some of the things that people can do to protect themselves or to make a shift?
Right. So there's a couple of things. One is, it's easy for me to say, like, don't eat canned foods, which is what I'll say. Don't eat canned foods. But we all know that things like canned beans and canned tomatoes are like a pretty basic staple in most people's homes. People are busier than ever. They want to cook and eat healthy, and these things help make that possible. And so, there's canned soups for me, like, are a no-no. I think that there are so many other types of soups that are available, whether it's soup that the grocery store makes, or soups that's in pouches or Tetra Pak boxes, which are better. They're not perfectly non-toxic, but they're better than BPA. A lot of these things are on a spectrum of we're not aiming for perfection.
It's good, better, best.
Yes, absolutely. And so, when it comes to canned foods, one, reducing exposure is important. Two, put an emphasis on avoiding foods in cans that are acidic. So canned tomatoes, tomato-based soup, canned pineapple, for example. So the more acidic the food is, the higher the rate of leaching from the can lining into the actual food, because in addition to heat and oil and abrasion, acidity is one of the things that will pull BPA out of the lining, or BPS, or whatever chemicals in there, into the food. And so highly acidic foods should preferably be purchased in glass containers. And a couple of companies have responded to consumer demands about this issue, exactly this issue, by producing jarred tomatoes. So you can get, jarred whole tomatoes, jarred pureed tomatoes, the same things that you would get in a can that would live in your pantry can be in a jar. Now, to your point, that the lid of that jar, whether it's a jar of tomato sauce or it's a ball canning jar, like the mason jars,
Yeah, make yourself. Yeah.
those lids do have a coating of BPA or a BPA resin.
Yeah.
And that's just one of those things where until an alternative and a safe alternative is found, that's the best that there is. So this, again, falls on that spectrum of good, better, best, right? Like, let's not drive ourselves crazy. If it's packed in glass, that's an A+ solution, even though that lid does have a potential to leach some chemicals into the food. But the surface area is a fraction of what it would be had been the entire can was a jar.
And often it's the lid is not touching.
Yes.
And so there's some exposure perhaps when it's heat processed and when it's pressurized.
Yep. But
beyond that, yeah,
there's not really a lot of surface area exposure. So there are a couple of can manufacturers that have actually switched to a totally different type of lining. So
tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's a yes and situation.
Sure.
So Eden Organics, Eden Foods, the bean companies, they do canned tomatoes too. They have been using a BPA-free can lining since 1999, so long before it was like a cool hip thing to talk about. And what they did was, they started learning about, like, wait a second, BPA has potential health effects. We don't want that in our cans. So they actually asked can manufacturers, like, what did you use before BPA, this new resin lining, was created? Like, what did you use? And they said, we used a vegetable-based enamel lining that's totally inert. Like, there's no leaching, there's no migration. And that's what we all used to use.
So then why did they switch?
Because the new type of epoxy lining that used BPA was far cheaper. That's why. It's always a dollar and cents. Always is a dollar and cents issue. So the can manufacturing industry as a whole moved to these BPA-based enamel lining and, or I should say epoxy resin linings. So Eden said, well, we're willing to pay the extra money and we want those types of linings that we know are inert and safe. And so Eden Foods has, since 1999, been packing their beans in BPA-free and estrogenic-free cans. They're an inert surface. But their canned tomatoes do not use that lining specifically because the FDA has not approved that lining
for that use
for acidic foods.
Yeah.
So Eden started manufacturing in glass, so they actually sell both now. So their canned tomatoes do still have a BPA epoxy lining, but their beans do not. Now, there's a lot of other companies that are started jumping on the BPA-free bandwagon in their canned foods, and it can actually be really tricky to sort of sift out who's being accurate and who's giving the whole truth. And they're under no legal obligation to tell you.
Yeah.
Which makes
and it's not like you can just go to the website and look. No. Like I know, as you said, that Eden Foods is doing that.
Yeah.
And they're very open and very transparent
yes.
about that. But other companies that say BPA-free lining don't really back that up.
Right. And so they don't.
It can be very difficult to find out who's doing that.
And so, there are a new breed of linings that have been produced and released that are polyester vinyl linings and other types of plastics, but they're brand new. There's no requirement that they be tested for safety. So we don't know if we're just swapping one problem for another.
And they're not inert.
And they're not necessarily, we don't know.
Yeah.
So they're polyester resins, they're polyvinyl chloride resins, which I would never, ever, ever want PVC in contact with my food. So, it has yet to be seen. So I always encourage people to err on the side of caution, buy all your beans from Eden Organics because we know that one is safe. This is not, I don't own stock in this company. This is not like a pitch. it's the safe option that we have. When you're buying canned processed tomatoes, make sure that they're in jars. This is sort of the simple stuff that can dramatically help us reduce exposure to bisphenol A that's coming in through our food. I think those are the big ones.
So are there other companies that are doing that as well that you know of that have a safe lining?
Yeah, so I believe, and again, there's not a lot of information to be had. And when you call their customer support, there's not a lot of information that they're willing to share with you. Native Forest is a company that makes canned coconut milks and things like that. My understanding is that they also use the same type of lining as Eden Foods or a similar one. So those are literally the only two canned foods that I will have is canned coconut milk from Native Forest and Eden Beans. Like I said, when it comes to things like sodas, which my guess is that your audience is not really a huge on the soda drinking bandwagon anyway. But sodas, the last couple of years we've had the La Croix sodas that like everyone's bananas for. They still have BPA in the lining. It's not a heat processed food, so the amount of leaching is less, but we're still getting exposed. And so I still encourage people to move away from canned foods whenever possible, especially if they're pregnant, planning on getting pregnant, nursing, have small children, any of those things. Really, those are the audiences that matter the most.
So then, talking about sodas, for example, one of the big things that I do is I encourage people to try and make their own.
Ooh,
because
fun.
you can use like a soda stream kind of device.
Yeah.
It is a plastic bottle.
Yep.
But so my question is, how do you feel about that?
It's a good question. And you can't decant those into other containers without losing.
Well, so here's the thing. You could make it, overpressurize it, and then immediately decant it into glass and seal it. And as long as it's an airtight glass container, it should still hold, because normally when you make it, it's a container that's meant to hold pressure, but glass canning containers, for example, are meant to hold pressure.
Sure.
So.
But the reality is people aren't going to do that. So
no. And I believe there is one company that they're a little bit more expensive. They do actually have glass jars for
great.
theirs. Yeah, but it's more, the truth is if you can buy a soda stream for $99 at Bed Bath & Beyond, you're going to go for that.
Yes, absolutely. So, this is where I would say a couple of things. One, the fact that you're making your own soda automatically tells me that you're mindful about the preservatives and chemicals and sugars and all that stuff that's in conventional store-bought sodas, and that you don't want to go that route. And so if you're doing something that's automatically healthier for you, then we have to take that into consideration too. This is not a black or white conversation. So is there going to be migration from chemicals in the plastic into your drink? Maybe.
Sure.
But the reality also is you're probably drinking that pretty quickly. So one of the things that also determines the levels of chemicals, whether it's BPA or anything else, and its ability to migrate is time. So when we're looking at canned foods or Poland Spring water bottle or any of these sort of anything that's packed in plastic, we have to remember that, there's no freshness date on a can of soda or a bottle of water. Like it could have been bottled 6 months ago.
Sure.
And it's been sitting in this, wrapping of plastic for that entire time. If you're making your own soda stream, you're probably drinking it within a couple of days.
Yeah.
So that to me also kind of automatically takes some of the pressure off or anxiety off of the fact that it's in plastic. I think we have to cut ourselves some slack sometimes and not step into a place where we're very dogmatic about these issues, because it tends to cause a lot of anxiety and stress when we live that way. And we have to remember that stress is toxic, right? So we want to approach this with a level head and some critical thinking and say this is better than that. So I'm going to cut myself some slack. I say the same thing about things like a Vitamix or a food processor. They're all made of polycarbonate plastic.
I know.
All
I
of
know.
them.
And, it's kind of funny because I have a grain mill
Yep.
and, I like to mill certain things myself because then I'm getting it fresh and I can soak it and all of that. The whole darn thing, except for the blades, is plastic.
Yes, same.
My Vitamix,
Yeah,
like you
they're
said.
all plastic. And so I always remind people that, like, if you're somebody who spent $500-$600 on a Vitamix,
Yeah.
you're probably somebody who's not putting like ring dings and ho-hos and orange soda in there.
Yeah.
You're somebody who's
Good God, I hope not.
I hope that. Well, also that combination sounds really revolting, but you're putting really healthy foods in there and you're making fresh foods. You're somebody who's investing in your health through an appliance. And so I always say that, the benefit of having a super green smoothie with hemp seeds and chia seeds and all that magic stuff, the health benefit is going to outweigh the potential health risk
Sure.
of being exposed to a chemical in that way. So, one of the things that we have to remember, whether it's BPA or anything else, is that our bodies do have a natural detoxification process. It's not sufficient enough to keep up with the kinds of chemicals that we're exposed to now. But one of the ways that we help that process, the detoxification process, is by eating foods that are health supportive. So if you're putting healthy foods into a blender or a food processor and you're cooking from scratch, just pat yourself on the back for doing an amazing job of protecting your health, and look at the other places in your home where you can have a bigger impact in phasing some of these chemicals out.
And that actually, leads into something else that's really important, because you and I have talked before about things, for example, someone buying an organic free-range chicken at a market that comes wrapped in plastic.
Yes.
Or someone who's buying salmon saying, gee, I'm eating salmon, it's so healthy for me, but they're not really looking at the quality of the meat. So, that organic free-range chicken is about as healthy as you can get. The only way to get it without the plastic is to buy it direct from the farmer.
Yep. But even then, they're still going to give it to you in a plastic bag.
Yeah, probably right.
Yeah.
And so, but you're getting great quality there.
Yeah.
Something like a salmon, just because it's salmon doesn't automatically make it healthy.
Yeah. So, that's a whole huge conversation, is looking at, there are foods that we just sort of generally automatically presume to be healthy and good for us. And in many cases that's true, but we have to look deeper. So what I always like to, think about is there's certain foods, most foods that the general public are eating come in packages that have labels with ingredients that give us some information. When we're buying things that are fresh, like meat and poultry and seafoods, they don't have labels.
Yeah.
It just says salmon, or it will tell you some information. It'll say it's grass-fed beef and it comes from this farm. So you have a little bit more context. And with salmon, it might say farmed or wild caught, or it might tell you where it comes from. Mm-hmm. And so that gives us more information, but it's still up to the consumer to understand what those terms mean and what is underneath those terms. Like, what does that mean to be grass-fed beef and pastured beef versus CAFO feedlot beef? What are the health implications and what are the contaminants that might be present? And the same thing is true for seafood. Mm-hmm. Those little bits of information that they do give us, the consumer has to be able to translate that into, okay, but what does that actually mean? Like, which one of them is healthier or better, or what's the difference aside from one grew up on a farm and one was caught in the wild?
Yeah.
And so those are all things that I think is really important for people to dive into, because the reality is there are all kinds of contaminants, from pesticides to things like methyl mercury, which is really common in seafood, to long since banned PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which were banned in the 1970s but are still showing up in our food supply because they're in our environment. And there's certain types of seafood that might have higher levels than others. And so being mindful of how to navigate that, it really does come down to consumer awareness
And
unfortunately.
it's also about being proactive about your food, because
Yes.
you and I have talked about this before. Food manufacturers spend tens of millions of dollars trying to use the buzzwords, the keywords, the
Yes.
distractors. And so they'll say things like heart healthy. Have you had yours today? And people go, oh, I need that. And
Yeah.
they stop to look at where did it come from,
Yep.
and are the benefits really there? Because the truth of the matter is, using farmed salmon, for example, farmed salmon is going to be lower in those heart healthy omega-3s,
Yes.
simply because they're not getting the diet that they're
Yeah.
intended to get,
Yeah.
so that their body can make that omega-3. And
And
Michael
then you also have to factor in the pesticides that are used in the farming process, and the antibiotics that are used in the farming process.
And I think most people are
yeah.
not aware of the fact that, farmed salmon are fed an incredible amount of antibiotics in their food, because when they're grown in tight confines like that,
Yeah.
the incidence of mites, infection, disease
Yep.
risk all goes up. And then we,
Yeah.
of course, throw in the horrifying fact that they've now discovered that giving RBGH to trout makes them grow fat faster. And so they're looking at possibly doing that with salmon, because
We don't learn. Yeah. So, these are all, and one of the things that I want to point out, because this whole conversation has been about food, is that, this is not the only place where we're getting exposed to environmental chemicals. It's one facet of this conversation. We also have to look at, the products that we're buying and using every day that aren't food, that are personal care products, our household cleaners, the clothes that we buy, the laundry detergent that we buy, the furniture that we buy, all of these things, the food that containers we store our food in, right? Plastic.
Absolutely.
Can have BPA, can also have a whole bunch of other estrogenic compounds that similarly affect the body that aren't BPA. Our cooking utensils, our plastic strainers to strain our pasta, our plastic spatulas, like we're just surrounded by unnatural materials that have the potential to expose us to chemicals that, even in very small amounts, can still affect our health. And in many cases, our bodies, especially when it comes to things like estrogen or endocrine disrupting chemicals, our bodies are designed to respond to really teeny tiny, infinitesimally small levels of hormone, because that's how our bodies work. Our bodies are pumping out, when somebody's going through menopause or going through puberty, it's not like pounds of hormones. They're really tiny amounts that can cause dramatic fluctuations. And we know that pharmaceuticals are delivered in the body when people take their medications. Those are delivered in really tiny doses because they're bioactive at that level. And so when people say, oh, well, but the exposure to these chemicals is so tiny, it can't matter, we have to understand that that doesn't apply when it comes to chemicals that interfere with our hormones specifically.
Well, and it's also about the fact that it's not, yes, it's a tiny amount, but how much are you getting exposed? Because a tiny amount over a lot of exposures adds up to a lot.
Yes.
So one of the things that I also really want to point out, because you and I both kind of geek out about this stuff. We love talking about it. We love researching it and learning more. And we're the ones who do the research so that, the people we're reaching out to don't have to.
Yeah.
But one of the things that happens is, right now there are probably a couple of people watching this who are going, oh, really?
I know. And then to you, I say I am sorry and you're welcome at the same time.
Well, but here's the other thing, and I am very, very serious when I tell people this. You don't have to know everything all at once. You don't have to do everything all at once. But it is about being aware and beginning to develop that mindfulness around how this is impacting your entire environment, your food supply, your homes, your office, places that you go, everything that you're doing, and to just make one little change at a time.
Yeah, absolutely.
every small change that you make is something that you weren't doing before. And so maybe it's about saying, you know what, I'm going to reduce the amount of canned foods that I buy.
Yep,
or
absolutely.
I'm going to throw out all of my Teflon pans and invest the money in a good set of pans that don't have that nonstick coating on them.
Yep.
Or,
Absolutely.
those kinds of things. Just every small concrete step reduces that body burden just a little bit.
And in some cases, it can do it significantly. So there have been studies that have looked at both children and adults switching to a mostly organic diet, not even an entirely organic diet, and found that the circulating levels of pesticides in their body drop by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days. That's all it takes. So if, for a mom that's like, I just want to make sure that my kids are doing the best that they can and getting the best start in life, you can start making that happen in less than 1 week by switching. Like, yes,
Absolutely.
it's a
commitment.
It's a commitment, but the same is true for personal care products. So a study last year, I think it was either last year or earlier this year, looked at teenage girls and their use of personal care products. And that when they switched to personal care products that didn't have these harmful chemicals, their body burden levels of those chemicals in their bodies dropped significantly in just a 10 to 12 day period. So it shows us that our bodies are good at taking the stuff out, but it needs our help in terms of reducing our exposure. And that's where, we just like you said, you do one thing at a time. I always tell people, especially when it comes to whether it's plastics in the kitchen or personal care products, if you want to use what you have until you have the opportunity, until you run out, and then you say, okay, I got to buy a new bottle of shampoo, I'm going to find one that's better. I'm going to find one that's safer, that's not made with these chemicals.
Sure. And I think that's part of it too, is if you make those changes in a slow, mindful fashion, you're much more likely to stick with it. Because if you run upstairs right now and throw out everything, you're not going to be able to stick to it. First of all, because you're not going to be able to remember everything. When you do it a little bit at a time, you begin to remember what changes you were trying to make, what are the products
and
that
why you were making them.
Exactly. And then you just kind of go from there. So that's a really good thing. Well, Lara, this has been absolutely fabulous. And
good.
Talk for hours, but we're getting close to the end of our time.
I'm glad one of us was paying attention to the clock because I wasn't.
If someone wanted to learn more, how could they learn more about the things you and I have been talking about? Like, what's a great way for them to?
Absolutely. So first, people could just go to my website, which is laraadler.com. But I also have a free class that I'm teaching coming up in a couple of days that it really talks a lot about this. It's called Toxins 101, and it's really designed to help people understand, like, what are the key issues that people need to be aware of, what are the myths, what are these buzzwords. We'll kind of elaborate on some of the stuff that we talked about here. And, that is something that, just come check out the class. It's a free class. You can learn more about this. There's action steps. There's all kinds of sort of checklists and to-do lists that I'll be sharing with people. And in that free class, I am actually going to be talking about one of the courses that I teach, because this is what I do. I teach classes and help people really understand how they can apply this in their own lives, whether they're a practitioner who wants to work with their clients or patients, or whether somebody, really just wants to look after their own family's health. They don't want to have to do the research, but they want to really understand what the issues are. And so that class is called Tools for Teaching Toxicity. I've been teaching it for 5 years now.
Wow.
Nearly 1,000 people come through this class. It's an excellent introduction into this conversation. So I'll be talking about that class, that course that I teach in the free class that I'm the Toxins 101 class. So people can definitely jump into that. And otherwise they can just find me on Facebook and Instagram and all the places.
Well, and that's great. And, and I would encourage people to sign up for your newsletter, because I know you share lots of great information there as well, but really you are the expert when it comes to these toxins. And I'm so glad that, there's somebody like you who's breaking it down in a way that mainstream consumers and practitioners can understand so that we can begin to spread the word and hopefully affect change.
Yeah. And that it's not a doom and gloom conversation. Like, yes, absolutely. There's some stuff that is unpleasant in what we learn, but the reality is that there are action steps that we can take. There are silver linings to these conversations. And when we take those action steps, we are informed, we're educated, we're empowered, we're inspired by what we've learned. And in doing that, like, that's ultimately my mission, is to encourage and inspire people, regular people, to go out and make better changes into the products that they buy, to buy safer, healthier products. And when that's going to be health protective for them, but it also sends a message to industry. And the hope is that industry will over time change so that we don't have to worry about this stuff.
Yeah,
that would be the ultimate goal. I don't know if we're ever going to get there, but that's the ultimate goal.
Well, and you know, history shows we are affecting change. When we look at things that have happened even in the last 12 months, a committed group of consumers, you know, the more we do, the more, because they want your dollars, and things are changing. So that's
things
good.
Are definitely changing.
Lara, thank you so much. This has been really fun. And folks, don't forget to check out LaraAdler.com and definitely sign up for her free webinar. It's totally worth it. And the class is great too. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Talk
Mira.
to you later. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.